He sat, staring at a single point somewhere on the edge of the horizon. His unkempt hair fell in tangled gray strands over his shoulders, wrinkles snaked across his face, and a crooked, ugly scar ran from his forehead, clinging to his empty eye socket and splitting his face into two unequal halves, down to his chin. One floor below, other superfluous and useless people, scoundrels and heroes, forgotten soldiers of a non-existent country, were picking at stewed cabbage with aluminum forks. He cared nothing for them. But then, they cared nothing for him either. Everything was as usual. The war found Mikhail in the capital. He was about to return home when the radio announced Nazi Germany's treacherous invasion of the Soviet Union. Crowds of people stood under the loudspeakers, hanging on poles, looking at each other in confusion, whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. No one could have imagined that the worst nightmare of the century had already begun. Mikhail decided not to return home. What was the point if home might soon be gone altogether, simply because he, Mishka, had lost his nerve and had run away? He didn't call it patriotism, no. He simply knew it was the right thing to do. The lines at the recruiting offices were simply enormous. The living stream resembled the Ouroboros serpent swallowing its own tail. It was unclear where such a huge number of people were coming from and where they were going. A bespectacled man, resembling a librarian from the district center, politely asked Mishka's age, and when told he was 20, he merely shook his head. Before the war, no one would have drafted Mishka into the army. Only those over 21 were eligible. Before heading to the recruiting station, Mishka shopped around and visited friends, spending a fair amount, but managed to find everything he needed. A couple of bottles of moonshine, some flour, some cockerel-shaped lollipops. Spirits are very fond of bones, firewater, and sweets. Richard always believed that there was nothing worse than a job he hated. Under no circumstances should work be allowed to turn into daily torture or, even worse, a chore. Richard loved his job very much. The Russian language is complex to the point of mental numbness, and true experts in the entire country can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Richard was very proud that he could call himself an expert without any exaggeration. He learned Russian so as to avoid the need for a translator. 43-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Richard Riedel disliked working in the presence of strangers and performed torture directly in a tightly sealed, soundproofed room. He was not a sadist and derived no pleasure whatsoever from watching his latest victim writhe in agony. He considered himself a researcher. Riedel enjoyed obtaining information that his country so desperately needed. SS Obersturmbannführer Richard Riedel was a patriot. He always arrived at work immaculately dressed, clean-shaven, and in meticulously pressed clothes, thus emphasizing his superiority over the source of his information, his belonging to a far higher evolutionary stage than the creature that terrified him, watching his every move. Smiling charmingly at his reflection in the mirror and donning a snow-white doctor's coat, Richard washed his hands and went into his working room, as he called it. As a rule, sources of information fell into two categories: those who were hysterically afraid of the Obersturmbannführer and began shrieking and chattering as soon as he entered, and those who spat contemptuously in Riedel's face, laughed and cursed, boasting of their courage. In both cases, Richard remained impassive. At work, one must always maintain clarity of thought, and the material varies. There's nothing one can do about it. Crossing the threshold of the working room, the Obersturmbannführer realized that this Russian was somehow different from everyone else he had dealt with. And he didn't really look Russian. He was distinctly Mongoloid, short, broad-shouldered, and long-haired. It wasn't the prisoner's appearance that surprised Richard. What surprised the Obersturmbannführer was the indifference in the Russian's eyes. The boy seemed completely indifferent to what was going on around him. Even the fact that the prisoner was facing his executioner, and the poor fellow couldn't help but understand this, didn't bother the strange boy with eyes too narrow for a Russian. Sighing, Riedel decided not to bother himself with unnecessary guesses, explaining that the source of the information was under stress and therefore not perceiving the situation adequately. The old man felt no affection for his neighbors. Many of them were overly talkative at first, but seeing that he showed no reaction to their presence, they began to grumble and then responded with quiet hostility. After a while, they stopped noticing him altogether, treating him more like a piece of furniture and local color than a neighbor. And how else could one perceive a man who sat motionless in his rusty wheelchair for days on end, staring blankly at the sky, only occasionally pausing for food? Most of the veterans had a relative drop in every now and then. After such visits, the old people would smile, cry, and share their impressions for a long time. No one came to see the silent, long-haired cripple, ever. The shaman began laying out everything he needed at the edge: chicken bones, crushed candy, flour, bottles of moonshine, a knife with a wolf's paw handle. Very carefully, he removed a small drum, a family heirloom wrapped in rags, from his bag. Squatting down, Mikhail dug a small hole, reached for the leather cord around his neck, removed the wolf's tooth, and placed it in the hole. By midday, everything was ready. The wolf's tooth woven into a pattern of herbs and flour woven into the ground. To any outsider, it might have seemed like a simple jumble of lines, but for the shaman, the correct construction of the design was far more valuable than several years of his life spent studying. Scattering candy and bones across the clearing, Mishka thought he resembled a fisherman scattering bait, and the pattern on the ground was, in fact, nothing more than a net, except the fish caught in it could be so large that they could easily tear both the net and the hapless fisherman to shreds. The shaman wasn't afraid. He'd been taught not to fear in early childhood. Using a flint and steel, Mishka lit a fire, watching with a detached air as the flour ignited instantly, cleaner than a gunpowder, as tongues of flame raced across the grass, as they licked the chicken bones with bits of meat clinging here and there, as the candy bubbled and melted. Not as decisively as he would have liked, the shaman picked up his drum. Experimentally, he struck it softly a few times. The aroma of burnt flour and caramel enveloped Mishka, filling him with strength and an unshakable confidence that he was doing everything right. The monotonous rhythm of the drum carried him far, far away, clouds of smoke rising higher and higher. His eyelids grew heavy, and Mishka closed his eyes, still so clearly aware of what was happening around him. Finally, no longer fully aware of who he was, where he was, or what he even was, the shaman drew a small blade with a wolf's paw handle from its leather sheath and, reaching over the tooth pit, slashed his palm with force. Quickly swelling, hot drops of blood crawled heavily along the lines and old scars until they finally burst into the fire. Before reaching the ground, the blood began to boil, and the clouds of smoke became increasingly distinct with each passing moment. Holding his bleeding palm motionless, high above the fire, the shaman waited. The wolf's eyes were human, the green eyes of a very tired old man. The spirit watched the shaman warily, waiting to see what the man would do. The man stared long and hard into the otherworldly guest's eyes and said only, "I want to live. Help me." The wolf bared his teeth, nodded, and leaped at the shaman. Mishka feebly recoiled, but there was no need. His smoke-woven body dissipated. The fire died down. Everything returned to its normal, familiar state, leaving only a bitter taste and a throbbing pain in his palm. These were all minor details. The main thing was that now there was a great chance of survival, even in mortal danger. The more Richard worked with the prisoner, the more he surprised the Obersturmbannführer. At first, Riedel simply threatened the poor fellow with violence, mutilation, and other torments. But he soon realized that all this was empty talk for the strange fellow. Then the SS man tried to coax the prisoner into talking, not with the stick, but with the carrot, promising various benefits, from relaxed conditions to freedom of residence in Germany. All of this, of course, was a lie. The captured Red Army spy would be executed immediately after he revealed everything he knew. The Red Army soldier remained indifferent to everything. It was clear he was somewhere far removed from the office and his tormentor. He seemed to have already resigned himself to being hanged, or shot, or locked in a gas chamber. It didn't matter. The indifference of this young man, who still had a long life ahead of him, to his own fate disconcerted the Obersturmbannführer. The scout sat on a chair, looking not at his executioner, but somewhere far away, where there's no war, no soot, no smoke, where death is entirely natural, not threatening to scoop you out of a trench with a fiery ladle, where you don't wake up in the middle of the night because it's too quiet, which is never a good sign, where butterflies, not crows, circle above you in summer, where your soft paws tread carefully on the soft earth, and all around you is a world that embraces you like a child, and your flock treads just as softly beside you. Richard shook his head to dispel the illusion. It didn't help much. Somewhere in the back of his head, a dull ache had developed, now pulsing monotonously, disorienting him, making it difficult to concentrate on his work. And Riedel clearly felt that a strange Red Army soldier was to blame for everything. It was nonsense, of course. How could a bound and defenseless creature harm an SS man? Nevertheless, Richard was firmly convinced that his headache was precisely because of this indifferent spy. Glancing at the prisoner with hatred, Riedel left the room and went to the wash basin. After splashing himself with cold water, he stared into the mirror. As if feeling his own face, Riedel ran his fingertips over the smooth, cold surface, thin lips, a beak-like nose, deep-set black eyes, straight, raven black hair parted in the middle. Everything looked fine, except for the skin, which was too pale. Remembering how realistically he'd imagined himself in the body of a wolf somewhere far away, Richard shuddered involuntarily. Could this really happen? Was this what the boy sitting behind the wall was seeing? No wonder he couldn't care less about everything going on around him. Riedel smiled unpleasantly. No matter. He'd bring the boy back to reality very soon. However, the boy wouldn't be thrilled about it. Looking at himself in the mirror again, the Obersturmbannführer thought he looked very much like a bird of prey. When the nursing home where the elderly like them lived burned down in February, everyone walked around in a daze for over a week. Everyone knew their home could very well catch fire and burn down just like that. The elderly were most indignant when it became known that the government had allocated 100,000 rubles each to the families of veterans who died in the fire. They whispered that it was wrong to reward people who had abandoned their own parents. Meanwhile, everyone kept glancing at the silent man in the wheelchair. He certainly wouldn't be able to escape such a mess. And the old man sat and thought that if a fire broke out in their sad abode of the forgotten and unwanted, he wouldn't even try to save himself. In fact, he'd eagerly await the flames tearing him from the clutches of a life so hateful, so alien. Mishka remembered his first battle forever, down to the smallest detail. How, before he'd even finished digging a trench, those standing nearby, as if on command, slid into the shallow hole. How some never rose. How a man of about 40 lying nearby began frantically crossing himself and praying out loud. And a young lieutenant, seeing this, began shaming the poor man, saying it was unforgivable and that an unpleasant conversation awaited him after the battle. The conversation never took place. The lieutenant, wanting to raise the soldiers' morale by personal example, led them into the attack and was one of the first to receive his share of death. The 40-year-old man, the one who had been promised a dressing down by the lieutenant, was crawling and dragging the officer's body back to the trench to keep it out of the enemy's hands. He almost made it. A burst of fire ripped through both of them right at the embankment. Mishka didn't understand how they fought back. Most vividly imprinted in his memory was the unpleasant sound of them charging at the bayonet as the Nazi approached, and his knife, the same one with the wolf's paw handle, gritting against the ribs of the boy in the German uniform. The second battle was less memorable. The details had faded. Then the deaths of those around him became commonplace for Mishka. People were constantly dying around him. The shaman, however, wasn't even scratched. For his superb marksmanship, his ability to hide, and his ability to move silently, before the war, Mishka had been a hunter. He was transferred to the scouts. Mikhail coped with his new responsibilities, often helping the other boys. After all, he had far more experience. Everyone had become so accustomed to Mishka's invulnerability that they were simply stunned when he didn't return from yet another foray. He was caught in a pincer movement. He could feel their breath, hear their hoarse barks, knew where they were and who they were. He himself was the hunter, and they were trying to make him their prey. He knew how to hide He was silent even when they were prowling a mere step away. He spilled their blood, and they didn't even realize that their numbers were dwindling. And the crows cackled joyfully in the sky. They cornered him according to all the rules of hunting. The shaman rushed out of the forest right to the cliff, leaving him with nowhere to escape. They didn't shoot. They wanted to take him alive. Gripping the knife more comfortably, he bared his teeth, and a second later, the crow's cawing above the forest was shattered by a drawn-out wolf howl. The shaman knew he would survive. Richard wasted no more time on persuasion. The prisoner's snow-white robe, which had been worn since the morning, was splattered and smeared with red, his face a bloody mess. One eye oozed out. One of his kneecaps was drilled. Riddle knew he'd overdone it a bit at the beginning, but now there was no turning back. The boy held firm. He continued to sit with a detached expression, only twitching occasionally when the Obersturmbannführer moved on to the next stage of the interrogation. Richard's head was splitting with pain. It pulsated with fiery flashes at jagged intervals, sometimes slowly, then accelerating again. Riedel cursed through his teeth, continued the torture, and was furious that he didn't endure the pain as stoically as the captured scout. The Obersturmbannführer's only consolation was that the visions never recurred. The old man never even considered suicide. Not when they were piecing him back together, not when he was relearning how to use his hands, not when his joints were wrenched, and every cell in his body began to ache, reacting to the weather. You didn't give this life, and it's not for you to take it away. He sat by the window and looked at the sky, just like that, with nothing better to do. And moment after moment dragged on, hours stretching into days, weeks into months, and years into eternity. Sitting by the window, the old man expected nothing, wanted nothing. He simply killed time until time killed him. Mishka sat and watched as a raven-like man in a robe stained with blood, his blood, tormented his body. Thin threads of smoke woven from his body trembled occasionally, causing his muscles to move, mimicking a response to pain. A family heirloom, a small drum, lay on Mishka's lap. Every now and then, the shaman would begin to tap the drum softly, constantly varying the rhythm and force of his strokes. Then the man in a robe would grind his teeth, clutch his temples, rub his forehead, go into the next room, and place his head under the faucet. He thought it was helping because the shaman would temporarily stop tapping the taut leather of the drum and absently stroke the enormous white wolf lying nearby. Richard thought he was slowly going mad. The pain was tearing through his head, seeming to burst. The Obersturmbannführer fought the urge to bang his head against a wall or take a knife and cut the skin from the back of his head to his chin, releasing that haunting, echoing sound so it would finally leave Riedel alone. The spasms only briefly subsided when icy streams of water lashed the back of his head, and Richard would blissfully freeze, soaking up every moment of silence and calm. Occasionally, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Once, he even thought he saw a huge snow-white wolf lying in the corner of the workroom, grinning contentedly. But when Richard blinked, the vision vanished. It's all because of fatigue. The Obersturmbannführer reassured himself, "I've been working too much lately. It's fatigue. Just fatigue and a headache." Despite Richard's best efforts, the damned scout still hadn't said anything. "Okay, boy, since you're such a terrible conversationalist, it would be best for you to keep quiet until the day you die. Don't worry, it won't be long." Riedel considered his own joke quite successful, and the Obersturmbannführer's laughter croaked throughout the room. Richard picked up the tongs from the stand. "Open your mouth, little one. Say, ah, ah." Seeing the body sitting on a chair gasp, twitch, and lose consciousness, the shaman finally stood up. The drum blared at full volume, and Mishka, entering a trance, began performing a ritual dance. The enormous snow-white wolf also rose to his feet. His promise was about to be fulfilled when 43-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Richard Riedel, clutching his temples, fell to the floor and lost consciousness. The shaman tore the threads from the torture-ravaged body tied to a chair and leaned over the man with thin lips and a beak-like nose. The first to greet the shaman in his new body were a terrible headache and weakness. Skin, muscles, sensations, everything felt like a poorly fitting mask. Rising with difficulty from the floor and pulling off his dirty robe as he went, Mishka staggered toward the exit, not even glancing at the broken, now alien shell, the new refuge of his executioner. The next morning, 43-year-old SS Obersturmbannführer Richard Riedel did not appear in his office. His body was found dead in his own apartment, a cerebral hemorrhage. The old man stares at the sky all day long. Richard remembered the bewilderment and horror of waking up in someone else's mutilated body. He remembered how he'd tried unsuccessfully to explain to himself and others who he really was. He remembered how a Red Army sabotage group had kidnapped him just before his execution. How these people, whom he considered his worst enemies, had nursed him back to health, treated him, pitied him, and rejoiced at his return. He remembered how everyone had gone crazy with happiness when the war finally ended, how he'd adjusted to his new life in this strange country with such strange people, at once touching and cruel scoundrels and heroes, how he'd ended up here in a nursing home, because in the end, no one needed him. Not the foreign country, not the people, not even himself. The old man stares at the sky all day long. Sometimes he sees crows in the sky and smiles because these birds are so similar to him.